Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
One day when my son Jax was about 4 years old, as I was working on my sermon, I was thinking deep thoughts about the nature of God's love. I was on the verge of coming up with a monumental insight which would truly wow the congregation and surely win me brownie points in heaven. Suddenly, Jax wanted my attention. Mommy, mommy, mommy! He was tugging at my sleeve, making me completely lose my train of thought. Go away, I roared in an angry voice. Don't you see I'm trying to write about love? Poor sweet Jack started to cry. And then I realized the irony of what I had done and apologized and comforted him. In our reading from the letter of James, it says, let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. Several weeks ago, I preached about anger, and it is brought up again this week in our lectionary. Anger is a natural but complex human emotion, so it's no surprise that it is mentioned repeatedly. In Paul's letter to the Ephesians the other week, we heard the advice that it was okay to be angry, just don't respond with sin. This week, James also says it's okay to be angry, simply that we must listen first and be slow to anger. In other words, there are reasons to be angry, it's just best not to leap there first. In addition, once we are angry, there are constructive and destructive ways to handle it. According to Psychology Today, anger is often our way of unconsciously covering up other emotions. Emotions like feeling disregarded, unimportant, accused, guilty, untrustworthy, devalued, rejected, powerless, and unlovable. Emotions which we don't want to acknowledge because they make us feel too vulnerable. For instance, if I had stopped and paid attention to Jax and listened and considered my emotions before responding, I would have acknowledged that I was actually feeling fear about offering a bad sermon and looking foolish. So when Jax interrupted me, I felt even more fearful that I would fail. But instead of paying attention and acknowledging my real emotion of fear, I got angry. Anger sometimes makes us feel in control during a powerless situation. The thing about emotions is just because they are not physical doesn't mean that they evaporate when we ignore them. Emotions are actual things which can be transferred to others. For instance, when we are angry and that emotion is weighing us down, we want to get rid of that ugly feeling instead of this yuckiness inside of us. And a classic way to do this is to unload it onto someone else. That's called emotional dumping. For me, yelling at Jax unloaded my fear and anger onto him, releasing some of the pressure on me. However, then it was just dumped on him, and he released it by crying. Sometimes this dumping can work its way through a family or a community. You know, someone in the family yelled at someone else, then they get upset, they yell at the next person, and all the way down, and someone then kicks the dog. You know, it just works its way. It's like tossing around a hot potato. That's why anger, despite its ability to offer immediate emotional release from whatever originally provoked it, rarely resolves anything. It can often lead to a never-ending vicious cycle of hot potato. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. Another unhelpful way that people handle anger is through what is known as triangulation. This is when we not only dump our emotions, but compound it by not confronting the person directly in love. And I spoke about speaking to someone in love the last time. Maybe we are afraid to confront them. Maybe we feel they would be too upset if we did that. But we feel the need to have an emotional dump. So instead, if we're angry, for instance, at person A, instead of speaking to them directly, we have an emotional dump to person B and hope that it sort of filters up to person A. That's the triangulation. It sets up a triangle between three people and prevents direct communication. For instance, I once had a parishioner who was so upset with the church school director, but she didn't speak directly to the church school director. Instead, she whispered her criticism and anger to other parents in the parking lot. This allowed her to release her emotional baggage, to do an emotional dump, but never be held accountable for her criticism. Triangulation is cowardly. We all do it, and as do I. By the time the church school director indirectly learned of the criticism, the whisper campaign was well underway. She only heard rumors prefaced with the words, "People are saying." The church school director was blindsided and left holding this whole cloth of ugly emotions with no idea where they came from, and therefore left with no way of having a conversation to address the criticism and heal the relationship. Triangulation is one of the most damaging ways to deal with anger because it lacks honesty. And when pervasive through an organization or family, can destroy them. Triangulation selfishly demands its own way and denies any opportunity for communication and healed relationships. And when we engage in triangulation, not only by triangulating ourselves, but helping others facilitate their triangulation. In other words, if we are willing to be person B, carry the message, we hurt ourselves. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus himself gives some excellent advice on how to handle anger and conflict. He says that when angry, our first line of action is to speak directly, lovingly, and privately to that person. Try to resolve the tensions between us quietly. If that doesn't work, invite a few others to join in as witnesses. And then only if the first two options don't work, do we then publicly invite the larger community to take part. In other words, triangulation, going immediately and indirectly to the community, rather than the person you actually are angry with, is completely contrary to Jesus' teachings. Fortunately, even though we've all fallen into this behavior, we all do it, at least sometimes. God forgives us when we make mistakes. And happily, there are helpful ways to approach someone with whom we disagree. One of them is to speak to them through expressing these three statements. So if you're angry with someone, this is a helpful way to have a direct conversation with them. The first thing you say is, when you did this, identify their specific action. It made me feel this. In other words, you talk about your feelings, which are incontrovertible. As a result, I am this. And identify a tangible thing. For instance, had my church school director been able to speak to the angry parent, she might have said, when you complain to the other parents about what you saw as my lack of communication, but didn't address it with me, so she identified the thing, it made me feel hurt and dismissed. You identify the feelings. As a result, I began to worry that the church school community could split. You identify the tangible result. This form of speaking our truth in love allows us to speak our truth in a way that is not an attack, it's just a claiming of our emotions, and is therefore much more likely to be heard by the other, and much more likely to lead to healing. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. There are entire books written on anger. This is just a quick glance at two of the unhelpful ways to express it, emotional dumping and triangulation, and one helpful way of speaking directly to the person in love. Emotions are great gifts from God, but they can also get tangled up with misunderstandings and disagreements, which is one reason Jesus came to show us the right path. How do we engage with this life well? And even then, he offers forgiveness when we mess up. We all do, and it's part of the human condition. We're forgiven, we pick ourselves up, we move forward. Don't beat yourself up about mistakes. May we always be secure in the knowledge of God's unconditional love for us, for you.